Good evening and welcome to Said Little Temple. We are so happy you've joined us. My name is Alba and I use she, her pronouns. This is our first 2026 observance. Yay! And I'm so happy you are here. As always, the service is recorded and will be posted on our YouTube channel. Just a reminder, I am still at my parents' house and so the audio quality is not as good because I don't have the mic set up. Anyway, please remember to fill out our time and book survey for this month. In addition, sign up for our new event, the Wax Museum, which is going to be really cool, you guys. Please sign up. And participate in our ongoing pentagram art piece. We'll open today with our opening words, which will appear on the slide behind you. Please listen as I read them aloud, or read them aloud along with me at home. We welcome you into the light of the gods and light this flame in celebration. May its brightness symbolize our connection to the gods and the natural world. May you join us in this community of faith, cherishing love and with open hearts. So our theme for this month is greed, and our readings today are a short clip that goes over Midas from Gods and Heroes by Ferdinand Schmidt and Carl Friedrich Becker, translated by George P. Upton, and then also Critias by Plato, translated by Benjamin Jowett. Please note that the Critias is a fragment that ends in the middle of a sentence. We'll be doing part 1 of Critias today, and we'll do part 2 next time. Because the last month's theme is wealth, I've already covered much of what I wanted to say about greed and coveting it, but I really wanted to do this story, so we're combining sort of wealth and greed into one, and that's where we're doing another retelling of Midas. Also, you might notice I'm speaking incredibly quickly. That's because the readings for today are so long. So long. So, I will be going a little rapid fire today. Sorry about that. So we begin with our reading from Gods and Heroes. Once it happened that Silenus fell asleep in a wood and was left behind. Some Lydian priests found the old man and carried him upon a litter of branches to their king Midas, at whose palace Bacchus later arrived. Finding that Silenus had been hospitably entertained, Bacchus assured Midas that any wish of his should be granted. Midas requested that whatever he touched might turn to gold. The request was granted, but Midas soon found that his wish would prove fatal, for not only water and wine, but fruit and of all kinds of food would turn to gold when he touched them. Repenting his folly, he implored Bacchus to recall the gift. Taking pity upon him, Bacchus ordered him to bathe in the river Pactolus, having done which he was soon relieved. From that time the sands of the river became gold. So we'll now do Critias by Plato. This is also a dialogue, so there are characters, so I will let you know when each character is speaking. Timaeus. How thankful I am, Socrates, that I have arrived at last, and, like a weary traveller after a long journey, may be at rest. And I pray the being who always was of old, and has now been by me revealed, to grant that my words may endure in so far as they have been spoken truly and acceptably to him. But if unintentionally I have said anything wrong, I pray that he will impose upon me a just retribution, and the just retribution of him who errs is that he should be set right. Wishing then to speak truly in future concerning the generation of the gods, I pray to give me knowledge which of all medicines is the most perfect and best. And now having offered my prayer, I deliver up the argument to Critias, who is to speak next according to our agreement. Critias. And I, Timaeus, accept the trust, and as you at first said that you were going to speak of high matters, and begged some forbearance might be shown to you, I too ask the same or greater forbearance for what I am about to say. And although I well know that my request may appear to be somewhat ambitious and discourteous, I must make it nevertheless. For will any man of sense deny that you have spoken well? I can only attempt to show that I ought to have more indulgence than you, because my theme is more difficult, and I shall argue that to speak well of the gods to men is far easier than to speak well of men to men. For the inexperience and utter ignorance of his hearers about any subject is a great assistance to him who has to speak of it, and we know how ignorant we are concerning the gods. But I should like to make my meaning clear, if you follow me. All that is said by any of us can only be imitation and representation. For if we consider the likenesses which painters make of bodies divine and heavenly, and the different degrees of gratification with which the eye of the spectator receives them, we shall see that we are satisfied with the artist who is able in any degree to imitate the earth and its mountains, and the rivers and the woods and the universe, and the things that are more, and move therein, and further, that knowing nothing precise about such matters, we do not examine or analyze the painting. All that is required is a sort of indistinct and deceptive mode of shadowing them forth. But when a person endeavors to paint the human form, we are quick at finding out defects, and our familiar knowledge makes us severe judges of any one who does not render every point of similarity. And we may observe the same thing to happen in discourse. We are satisfied with the picture of divine and heavenly things, which has very little likeness to them, but we are more precise in our criticism of mortal and human things. Wherefore, if at the moment of speaking I cannot suitably express my meaning, you must excuse me, considering that to form approved likenesses of human things is the reverse of easy. This is what I want to suggest to you, at the same time to beg, Socrates, that I may have not less but more indulgence conceded to me in what I am about to say, which favor, if I am right in asking, I hope that you will be ready to grant. Socrates. Certainly, Critias will grant your requests, and will grant the same by anticipation to Hermocrates as well as to you and Timaeus, for I have no doubt that when his turn comes a little while hence, he will make the same request in which you have made, in order then that he may provide himself with a fresh beginning, and not to be compelled to say the same thing over again. Let him understand that the indulgence is already extended by anticipation to him. And now, friend Critias, I will announce to you the judgment of the theatre. They are of the opinion that the last performer was wonderfully successful, and that you will need a great deal of indulgence before you will be able to take his place. Hermocrates. The warning, Socrates, which you have addressed to him I must also take to myself. But remember, Critias, that faint heart never yet raised a trophy, and therefore you must go and attack the argument like a man. First invoke Apollo and the Muses, and then let us hear you sound the praises and show forth the virtues of your ancient citizens. Critias. Friend Hermocrates, you who are stationed last and have another in front of you, have not yet lost heart. The gravity of the situation will soon be revealed to you. Meanwhile, I accept your exhortations and encouragement, but besides the gods and goddesses whom you have mentioned, I would specifically invoke Mnemosyne, for all the important part of my discourse is dependent on her favor. And if I can recollect and recite enough of what was said by the priests and brought hither by Solon, I doubt not that I shall satisfy the requirements of this theatre. And now, making no more excuses, I will proceed. Let me begin by observing first of all that 9,000 was the sum of years which had elapsed since the war which was said to have taken place between those who dwelt outside the Pillars of Hercules and all who dwelt within them. This war I am going to describe. Of the combatants on one side, the city of Athens was reported to have been the leader, and to have fought out the war. The combatants on the other side were commanded by the kings of Atlantis, which, as I was saying, was an island greater in extent than Libya and Asia, and, when afterwards sunk by an earthquake, became an impassable barrier of mud to voyagers sailing from hence to any part of the ocean. The progress of history will uphold the various nations of barbarians and families of Hellenes which then existed as they successively appear on the scene. But I must describe first of all the Athenians of that day, and their enemies who fought with them, and the respective powers and governments of the two kingdoms. Let us give precedence to Athens. In the days of old, the gods had the whole earth distributed among them by allotment. There was no quarreling, for you cannot rightly suppose that the gods did not know what was proper for each of them to have, or, knowing this, that they would seek to procure for themselves by contention that which was more properly belonged to others. They all of them, by just apportionment, obtained what they wanted, and peopled their own districts. And when they had peopled them, they tended us their nurslings and possessions as shepherds tend their flock, excepting only that they did not use blows or bodily force, as shepherds do, but governed us like pilots from the stern of the vessel, which is an easy way of guiding animals, holding our souls by the rudder of persuasion according to their own pleasure. Thus did they guide all mortal creatures. Now different gods had their allotments in different places, which they set in order. Hephaestus and Athene, who were brother and sister, and sprang from the same father, having a common nature, and being united also in the love of philosophy and art, both obtained as their common portion this land, which was naturally adapted for wisdom and virtue. And there they implanted brave children of the soil, and put into their minds the order of government. Their names are preserved, but their actions have disappeared by reason of the destruction of those who received the tradition, and the lapse of ages. For when there were any survivors, as I have already said, they were men who dwelt in the mountains, and they were ignorant of the art of writing, and had heard only the names of the chiefs of their lands, but very little about their actions. The names they were willing enough to give to their children, but the virtues and laws of their predecessors they knew only by obscure traditions, and as they themselves and their children lacked for many generations of the necessaries of life, they directed their attention to the supply of their wants, and of them they conversed to neglect of events that happened in times long past. For mythology and the inquiry into antiquity are first introduced into cities when they begin to have leisure, and when they see that the necessaries of life have been already provided, but not before. And this is the reason why the names of the ancients have been preserved to us, and not their actions. This I infer because Solon said that the priests in their narrative of that war mention most of the names which are recorded prior to the time of Theseus, such as Cercops and Erechtheus and Erchthonius and Eristhethon, and the names of the women in like manner. Moreover, since military pursuits were then common to men and women, the men of those days, in accordance with the custom of the time, set up a figure and image of the goddess in full armor to be a testimony that all animals which associate together, male as well as female, may, if they please, practice in common the virtue which belongs to them without distinction of sex. Now the country was inhabited in those days by various classes of citizens. There were artisans, and there were husbandmen, and there was also a warrior class originally set apart by divine men. The latter dwelt by themselves and had all things suitable for nurture and education. Neither had any of them anything of their own, but they regarded all that they held as common property, nor did they claim to receive of the other citizens anything more than their necessary food, and they practiced all the pursuits which we yesterday described as those of our imaginary guardians. Concerning the country, the Egyptian priests said what is not only probable but manifestly true, that the boundaries were in those days fixed by the isthmus, and that the direction of the continent they extended as far as the heights of Catharon and Parnus. The boundary line came down in the direction of the sea, having the district of Oropus on the right, with the river of Asopus as the limit on the left. The land was the best in the world, and was therefore able to support a vast army raised from the surrounding people. Even the remnant of Attica, which now exists, may compare with any region in the world for the variety and excellence of its fruits and the suitableness of its pastures to every sort of animal, which proves what I am saying. But in those days the country was fair as now, and yielded far more abundant produce. How shall I establish my words, and what part of it can be truly called a remnant of the land that then was? The whole country is only a long promontory extending far into the sea away from the rest of the continent, while the surrounding basin of the sea is everywhere deep in the neighborhood of the shore. Many great deluges have taken place during the 9,000 years, for that is the number of years which have elapsed since the time of which I am speaking, and during all this time, and through so many changes, there has never been any considerable accumulation of the soil coming down from the mountains as in other places, but the earth has fallen away all round and sunk out of sight. The consequence is, that in comparison of what then was, there are remaining only the bones of the wasted body, as they may be called. As in the case of small islands, all the richer and softer parts of the soil having fallen away, and the mere skeleton of the land being left. But in the primitive state of the country, its mountains were high hills covered with soil; the plains, as they are termed to us, of Phelus, were full of rich earth, and there was abundance of wood in the mountains. Of this the last traces still remain, for although some of the mountains now only afford sustenance to bees, not so very long ago there were still to be seen roofs of timber cut from trees growing there, which were of a size sufficient to cover the largest houses, and there were many other high trees cultivated by man and bearing abundance of food for cattle. Moreover, the land reaped the benefit of annual rainfall, not as now, losing the water which flows off the bare earth into the sea, but having an abundant supply in all places, and receiving it into herself and treasuring it up in the close clay soil, led off into the hollows the streams which it absorbed from the heights, providing everywhere abundant fountains and rivers, of which there may still be observed sacred memorials in places where fountains once existed, and this proves the truth of what I am saying. Such was the natural state of the country, which was cultivated, as we may well believe, by true husbandmen who made their husbandry their business, and were lovers of honor, and of a noble nature, and had a soil the best in the world, and abundance of water, and the heaven above, and excellently a temperate climate. Now the city in those days was arranged on this wise. In the first place, the Acropolis was not as now. For the fact is that a single night of excessive rain washed away the earth and laid bare the rock. At the same time there were earthquakes, and then occurred the extraordinary inundation, which was the third before the great destruction of Deucalion. But in primitive times the hill of the Acropolis, extending the Eridanus and Ilissus on the side of the Pnyx, and included the Pnyx on one side, and the Lycabettus as a boundary on the opposite side to the Pnyx, and was well covered with soil, and level at the top except in one or two places. Outside the Acropolis, and under the sides of the hill, there dwelt artisans, and such of the husbandmen as were tilling the ground near. The warrior class dwelt by themselves around the temples of Athene and Hephaestus at the summit, which moreover they had enclosed with a single fence like the garden of a single house. On the north side they had dwellings in common, and erected halls for dining in winter, and had all the buildings which they needed for their common life, besides temples, but there was no adorning of them with gold and silver, for they made no use of these for any purpose. They took a middle course between meanness and ostentation, and built modest houses in which they and their children's children grew old, and they handed them down to others who were like themselves, always the same. But in the summer time they left their gardens and gymnasia and dining halls, and then the southern side of the hill was made use of them for the same purpose. Where the Acropolis now is, there was a fountain which was choked by the earthquake, and has left only a few small streams which still exist in the vicinity, but in those days the fountain gave an abundant supply of water for all and of a suitable temperature in the summer and winter. This is how they dwelt, being the guardians of their own citizens, and the leaders of the Hellenes, who were the willing followers, and they took care to preserve the same number of men and women through all time, being so many as were required for warlike purposes, then as now, that is to say, about 20,000. Such were the ancient Athenians, and after this manner they righteously administered their own land and the rest of Hellas. They were renowned all over Europe and Asia for the beauty of their purposes and for the many virtues of their souls, and of all men who lived in those days they were the most illustrious. And next, if I have not forgotten what I heard when I was a child, I will impart to you the character and origin of their adversaries. For friends should not keep their stories to themselves, but have them in common. Yet before proceeding further within the narrative, I ought to warn you that you must not be surprised if you should perhaps hear Hellenic names given to foreigners. I will tell you the reason of this. Solon, who was intending to use the tale for his poem, inquired into the meaning of the names, and found that the early Egyptians in writing them down had translated them into their own language, and he recovered the meaning of several names, and when copying them out again, translated them into our language. My great-grandfather Japetus had the original writing, which is still in my possession, and was carefully studied by me when I was a child. Therefore, if you hear names such as you are used to in this country, you must not be surprised, for I have told how they came to be introduced. The tale, which was of great length, begins as follows. I have before remarked, in speaking of the allotments of the gods, that they distributed the whole earth into portions differing in extent, and made for themselves temples and instituted sacrifices. And Poseidon, receiving for his lot the island of Atlantis, begat children by immortal women, and settled them in a part of the island which I will describe. Looking towards the sea, but in the center of the whole island, there was a plain which is said to have been the fairest of all plains and very fertile. Near the plain again, and also in the center of the island, at a distance of about 50 stadia, there was a mountain not very high on any side. In this mountain there dwelt one of the early born primeval men of that country, whose name was Evenor, and he had a wife who was named Leucippe, and they had their only daughter who was called Cleitio. The maiden had already reached womanhood when her father and mother died. Poseidon fell in love with her, and had intercourse with her, and breaking the ground enclosed the hill which she dwelt all round, making alternate zones of sea and land, larger and smaller, encircling one another. There were 2 of land and 3 of water, which he turned as with a lathe, each having a circumference its equidistance every way from the centre, so that no man could get to the island, for ships and voyages were not as yet. He himself, being a god, found no difficulty in making special arrangements for the centre of the island, bringing up 2 springs of water from beneath the earth, one warm water and the other cold, and making every variety of food to spring up abundantly from the soil. He also begat and brought up 5 pairs of twin male children, and dividing the island of Atlantis into 10 portions, he gave to the firstborn of the eldest pair his mother's dwelling and the surrounding allotment, which was the largest and best, and made him king over the rest. The others he made princes, and gave them rule over many men and large territory. And he named them all. The eldest, who was the first king, he named Atlas, and after him the whole island and the ocean were called Atlantic. There was a twin brother who was born after him, and obtained as his lot the extremity of the island headed toward the Pillars of Hercules, facing the country which is now in the region of Gades. In that part of the world he gave the name which in the Hellenic language is Eumelus, in the language of the country which is named after him, Guiderius. Of the second pair of twins he called one Amphiras and the other Vaemon. To the elder of the third pair of twins he gave the name Menissus and Autochthon to the one who followed him. Of the fourth pair of twins he called the elder Elasippus and the younger Mestor. And of the fifth pair he gave to the elder the name of Azaeus, and to the younger that of Diapropes. All these and their descendants for many generations were the inhabitants and rulers of divers islands in the open sea, and also, as has been already said, they held sway in our direction over the country within the Pillars, as far as Egypt and Tyrrhenia. Now Atlas had numerous and honorable family, and they retained the kingdom, the eldest son handing it on to the eldest for many generations. And they had such an amount of wealth as was never before possessed by kings and potentates, and is not likely to ever again and they were furnished with everything which they needed both in the city and country. For because of the greatness of their empire, many things were brought to them from foreign countries, and the island itself provided most of what was required by them for the uses of life. In the first place, they dug out of the earth whatever was to be found there, solid as well as fusile, and that which is now only a name, and was then something more than a name, or caluncum, was dug out of the earth in many parts of the island, being more precious in those days than anything except gold. There was an abundance of wood for carpenters' work, and sufficient maintenance for tame and wild animals. Moreover, there were a great number of elephants in the island, for as there was provision for all other sorts of animals, both for those which live in lakes and marshes and rivers, and also for those which live in the mountains and on plains, so there was for the animal which is the largest and most voracious of all. Also whatever fragrant things there are in the earth, whether roots, or herbage, or woods, or essences which distill from fruit and flower, grew and thrived in that land. Also the fruit which admits of cultivation, both the dry sort which is given us for nourishment, and any other which we use for food, we call them by the common name of pulse, and the fruits having a hard rind, affording drinks and meats and ointments, and a good store of chestnuts and the like, which furnish pleasure and amusement, and are fruits which soil with keeping, and the pleasant kind of dessert, with which we console ourselves after dinner when we are tired of eating, all these the sacred island which then beheld the light of the sun brought forth fair and wondrous and in infinite abundance, with such blessings the earth freely furnished them. Meanwhile they went on constructing their temples and palaces and harbors and docks, and they arranged the whole country in the following manner. First of all, they bridged over the zones of sea which surrounded the ancient metropolis, making a road to and from the royal palace. At the very beginning, they built the palace habitation of the god and of their ancestors, which they continued to ornament in successive generations, every king surpassing the one who went before him to the utmost of his power, until they made the building a marvel to behold for size and for beauty. And beginning from the sea, they bored a canal of 300 feet in width and 100 feet in depth and 50 stadia in length, which they carried through to the outermost zone, making a passage from the sea to this, which became a harbor, and leaving an opening sufficient to enable the largest vessels to find ingress. Moreover, they divided at the bridges the zones of land which parted the zones of sea, leaving room for a single trireme to pass out of one zone into another, and they covered over the channels so as to leave a way underneath for ships, for the banks were raised considerably above the water. Now the largest of the zones into which a passage was cut from sea was 3 stadia in breadth, and the zone of land which came next of equal breadth, but the next 2 zones, the one of water, the other of land, were 2 stadia, and the one which surrounded the central island was only a stadium in width. The island in which the palace was situated had a diameter of 5 stadia. All this, including the zones and the bridge, which was the sixth part of a stadium in width, they surrounded by a stone wall on every side, placing towers and gates on the bridges where the sea passed in. The stone which was used in the work they quarried from underneath the center island and from underneath the zones on the outer one as well as the inner side. One kind was white, another black, a third red, and as they quarried, they at the same time hollowed out double docks having roofs formed out of their native rock. Some of their buildings were simple, but in others they put together different stones varying the color to please the eye, and to be a natural source of delight. The entire circuit of the wall, which went around the outermost zone, they covered with coating of brass, and the coating of the next wall with tin, and the third, which encompassed the citadel, flashed with the red light of orichalcum. The palaces in the interior of the citadel were constructed on this wise. In the center was a holy temple dedicated to Clito and Poseidon, and which remained inaccessible, and was surrounded by an enclosure of gold. This was the spot where the family of 10 princes first saw the light, and thither the people annually brought fruits of the earth in their season from all the 10 portions to be an offering to each of the 10. Here was Poseidon's own temple, which was a stadium in length and half a stadium in width, and of a proportionate height, having a strange barbaric appearance. All the outside of the temple, with the exception of the pinnacles, they covered with silver, and the pinnacles with gold. In the interior of the temple the roof was of ivory, curiously wrought everywhere with gold, silver, and orichalcum, and all the other parts, the walls and pillars and floor, they coated with orichalcum. In the temple they placed statues of gold. There was the god himself standing in a chariot, the charioteer of 6 winged horses, and of such a size that he touched the roof of the building with his head. Around him there were 100 Nereids riding on dolphins, for such was thought to be the number of them by men of those days. There were also in the interior of the temple other images which had been dedicated by private persons, and around the temple on the outside were placed statues of gold of all the descendants of the 10 kings, and of their wives, and there were many other great offerings of kings and of private persons coming both from the city itself and from the foreign cities over which they held sway. There was an altar too, which in size and workmanship corresponded to this magnificence, and the palaces in like manner answered to the greatness of the kingdom and the glory of the temple. In the next place they had fountains, one of cold and another of hot water, in gracious plenty of flowing, and they were wonderfully adapted for use by reason of the pleasantness and excellence of their waters. They constructed buildings about them and planted suitable trees. They also made cisterns, some open to the head and others roofed over, to be used in winter as warm baths. There were the king's baths and the baths of private persons, which were kept apart, and there were separate baths for women and for horses and cattle, and to each of them they gave as much adornment as was suitable. Of the water which ran off they carried some to the grove of Poseidon, where were growing all manner of trees of wonderful height and beauty, owing to the excellence of the soil, while the remainder was conveyed by aqueducts along the bridges to the outer circles, and there were many temples built and dedicated to many gods, also gardens and places of exercise, some for men, others for horses, in both of the two island zones on both of the two islands formed by the zones, and in the center of the larger of the two was set apart a racecourse of a stadium in width and in length allowed to extend around the entire island for horses to race in. Also, there were guard houses at intervals for guards, their most trusted of whom were kept and appointed to keep watch in the lesser zone, which was near the Acropolis, while the most trusted of all had houses given them within the citadel, near the persons of the kings. The docks were full of triremes and naval stones, and all things were quite ready for use. Enough of the plan of the royal palace. And thankfully, that is all for today. That was a lot to read. So we'll pick up with part 2 on the 24th. Definitely remember to sign up for our wax museum and our pentagram project. So we'll now move into the ritual portion of the observance, and I will play the video. We leave this offering for our gods to symbolize our connection and devotion. We gift this rock to symbolize the stability of the gods in our world. We gift this water to accept the flow of our lives. We welcome life and bless our offerings with oil to share our riches. We embrace our connection to each other and the world and celebrate our revival. We will now move into the closing words, and you can read them aloud along with me or listen as I read the words aloud. As we move out into the world, let us remember our community of faith. Cherish love and open your heart as you walk through life. Hold dear the light of the gods and their connection with the natural world. Go forth in celebration and carry the light of connection within your heart.